Celebrations now, come on. Why am I so happy? Why could I be so happy? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because my book, The Gallipoli Evacuation, is now available to buy. Hooray! Forget all that and pre-ordering, forget all that. You can actually buy it. You can buy it all over the world through the wonders of the internet. You can pay in a wide range of currencies, and all you have to do is go to our website, which is livinghistoryytv.com. livinghistoryytv.com. You know it makes sense. Buy today.
A Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History. Hello, and welcome to Peter Hart's Military History Podcast. We've got a lovely episode for you today. We're doing the Siege of Tobruk and the conditions the men lived under. And whenever you think of men living under sordid conditions with everything going wrong in their lives, their personal life, an absolute disaster, unable to cope...
You think of us?
No, you, Gary. They think of you. And so I'd like to welcome Gary Bain. Here you are, Gary. Have you got the dog with you? That's what I've noticed from our Twitter feed, that the only thing that anyone's interested in is, one, that someone once called us a pair of bitter wankers, and, which is our favourite ever review, and secondly, the dog.
No, I don't know where he is. I've taken him for a walk. I think I've lost him.
Oh, well, I'm sure he'll come and make his presence felt in that unique fashion that he has. Anyway,
so today we're doing a lovely episode, as you describe it, on a siege.
Yes, a siege. Just to cheer up our listeners. It's quite. I mean, this by the time this comes out, I'm hoping we'll all be out of lockdown, but I'm not sure we will be. I think it's coming out in about September. So, but we're still in lockdown. So siege is quite good. But one thing I want to make clear is that we talk about lockdown being bad, but just imagine how bad it is in the real world at Tobruk. A proper siege with not only, being locked away from the ones you love, with only your comrades to keep you warm at night, and you've got an ever-present chance of being killed by the Germans or the Italians. So that that's an underlying thing. So we're going to talk about it. It's for the men. I interviewed about 50 of them. I think a lot of them were at Tobruk. A lot of them, and it's just endless days and nights in a desert, and a lot of tedium mixed with sort of nerve-shredding terror. That sort of sudden moment when it's like when you're doing something you shouldn't be doing, and Janet comes into the room. That sort of utter screaming terror that just makes your whole world rock.
So who's at Tobruk, Pete? We haven't said. So it's the South Notts Hussars, presumably,
that's who
that we're going to be talking about
yeah.
today.
It's probably a good idea to mention that, Gary. Ever the consummate professional. Yes, it's the South Notts Hussars, 107 Regiment, Royal Horse Artillery, and we're looking at they were besieged in Tobruk, and we discussed that in our last episode about the fighting. And this time we're just going to look at what it was like to live there. They're on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 9 long months, Gary. I mean, we're moaning about lockdown. It's only been 3 months or 4 months. Any moment a shell could crash down and kill them, and stress levels are very high. They really are. So there they are, sit there in the gun pits, waiting for a possible everything to end in horror.
And also, pretty much nothing to do, I wouldn't have thought either. So you've got boredom, as you well know. The military life can sometimes be 95% of the time you're bored out of your brain, and then 5% sheer terror.
Yeah, it's a bad thing. And one of the people I remember interviewing was a chap called Captain William Pringle, known to his men as Bill in the most appallingly affectionate and thing. He was a miserable Scot, and I'd like to dedicate... I mean, I've never heard the word Scot without the word miserable just before. Have you? I mean, Gary, be fair, join me in this. I'm sure you'll support me in this. Have you ever heard of...
I have Scottish parents. My mum was pretty miserable, as I seem to remember.
Well, that's probably because of her dad. I think you'll find Janet's quite miserable for, I don't know what the correlation is. Male Bains, I suspect. Anyway, Bill Pringle was a gruff, miserable Scot, and he wanted to try and maintain some basic standards, and he thought it was important that the men kept up their sense of their appearance and hygiene to boost their self-respect. It's this idea, it's a classic military idea. And Bill Pringle said this: "I personally was a stickler with my men. I shaved every day and insisted that they did. They didn't like it to start with, but I think they appreciated how much better they felt once they'd shaved, as opposed to being scruffy with a couple of days' growth and always rubbing their chins. It didn't take them very long to shave, and once we'd got the facts of life established, there wasn't any problem." So there he is, teaching his men the facts of life in a Tobruk gunpit. What do you say to that, Gary? Would it have inspired you?
Well, I got a slight issue with it, because some of the pictures that I've seen, and they're available on the internet as well, if people want to go and have a look, I'm not entirely sure everybody followed his example from what I've seen.
And that's a great thing about oral history. Sometimes, people have this image of themselves and their men that doesn't quite match up to reality. I'm sure some of your officers had a sort of idyllic vision of you. They sort of thought of you as the perfect soldier. This man's worthy of being promoted to Lance Corporal. What a disappointment.
All. Not some. All.
Yes. Was it ever a disappointment to them, your conduct after the promotion?
No.
And the reasons for being depromoted? Just bad luck?
Oh, just wrong place, wrong time.
You were caught.
Yeah.
It is difficult to maintain good morale, and it's also, there's something else. There's something quite scary at Tobruk, and I want to get. You've got a great quote from a chap called Lance Sergeant Bob Folds. Now, his daughter provided a lot of the pictures for my book, which I'm accidentally going to mention, At Close Range, and you can get the audio version now. It's lovely, isn't it, Gary? But his daughter gave us the pictures that Bob Folds collected during his military career, and he becomes aware of something threatening beyond the perimeter of Tobruk. What is it? What is he threatened by?
Lance Sergeant Bob Folds. We went to look at these damaged tanks, and there was this great big 75mm gun. The tank gun we were used to was a 2-pounder sticking out in front. We heard about German paratrooper troops taking Crete, and we thought, what about Tobruk? Are they going to drop on us next? We felt very isolated and very cut off. We began to wonder whether, in fact, we were going to be able to hold out in Tobruk.
Because
that's a good point, isn't it? This is the Germans. So that's a very good point he's making there.
I mean, and we know, Gary, what happened. We know the Germans don't land paratroopers on Tobruk. We know that in the end they hold out and the siege, But in 1941, April, May, June, they didn't know that they could all be going to be killed or captured, wounded. The Germans must have seemed like supermen at times. I remember they just smashed through the whole British army in Europe. There'd been Dunkirk. Oh dear!
Well, it's also, in comparison to the Italians, as we've said before, the Italians were not bad soldiers, but there were questions around supply, for example, and the Germans were better supplied, still had supply issues. Their supply lines were very, very long, but they had good kit. It was modern. They were well trained, and they were formidable. And you're quite right. If you're hearing tales of paratroopers dropping on Crete, you must have thought, we're next.
Indeed, and this is so that they're desperate to be relieved. And I don't mean, latrine-wise. I mean, they were desperate to be rescued. And, of course, Churchill was keen to get in there, and he put a lot of pressure on Wavell, the commander of the Middle East. Poke. Classic Churchill. No looking at military realities. No sense of what is and isn't possible. Just wish fulfillment ideas. The idea, I want Tobruk relieved. I want you to launch, and what happened was Operation Battle Axe. It's a premature offensive undertaken with inadequate resources and preparation. It was launched on the 15th of June 1941, and It was a failure, wasn't it, Gary?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of questions about it, really. So my first question is why Wavell didn't just refuse point blank. But also, I presume that the RAF had a role here, and so, you'd have to attack the supply lines and the airfields. Was that done in earnest? Given how quickly they launched this attack, was there any hope of success?
I don't think there was. I mean, it's just he couldn't say no. You can't say no to the British Prime Minister, who's you just get dismissed, and he does dismiss everybody that argues with him in the end. Until he gets a yes man in. I have no time for Churchill as a general. I'm all right with him as a political war leader. As a leader of our country, oh dear, and the Desert Air Force, wasn't ready. It didn't have the right aeroplanes. It's too early. This is June. It's only a few weeks, 3 or 4 weeks after, 4 or 5 weeks after the siege had started proper. And what happens is a disaster. They're attacking well-established German defences, guns and mines, which is just what keeps the Germans out of Tobruk. It also keeps the British back. And then there's strong German counterattacks. In fact, Rommel almost, he does one of his encircling manoeuvres, and it's almost a bloody disaster.
Yeah, and I think the first day, the British losses in tanks are well over 50%, I believe.
Are they?
Just on that first day.
It sounds about right. I know it's terrible. I haven't got the stats. You know me and stats. I never remember anything. Result of it is Wavell sacked. Attack. I will attack then. Disastrous failure. Yeah, fired, you bastard. Oh, dear. And he's replaced with General Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief Middle East. Auchinleck's a really interesting chap. One day we might do a podcast on him. He was an old Indian Army soldier in the sense that he'd served in India. He was at the Delhi Durbar. He lived until the 80s. He was still alive when I started work at the War Museum. I know you were only about 7 when I started work at the War Museum. But he's a new broom coming into the Middle East. But the failure of Operation Battle Axe, what impact do you think that has on the chaps at Tobruk? Do you think it's...
Well, it's not... It's not going to do their morale very good, but then they're going to start thinking that they are actually trapped. Bearing in mind that they fell back on Tobruk deliberately, so they've invited this siege, that's going to say you're trapped. You're going nowhere.
Yeah, and here's a Battery Quartermaster Sergeant Charles Ward, and he says, there was supposed to be this great push, and it failed. Now, can you imagine? That was a tremendous disappointment, and morale went sagging after that. Because we were all buoyed up. You all expected this to be the great relief, and we were all going back to Cairo, and it didn't happen. So that didn't help. And even Bill Pringle, found that his trusty shaver, inspirational shaving, wasn't exactly working. And here's Bill again. Why am I calling him Bill? Pringle, Captain Pringle. He says this: there was a definite low point when the push that was supposed to get us didn't. They were uncooperative. You might say, come on, you haven't shaved today. And he would say, so what? I realised it was no good trying to tell a chap off, because it would only make it worse. I would tell him that life wasn't as bad as that. He was still alive. There were plenty far worse off than him, buried in the desert. But it's not exactly an inspirational battle cry, isn't it? Look, mate, it's not as bad for you as your mates who are dead. Yes. And what do you think keeps them going, the South Notts Hussars, in any of the troops besieged? What do you think's the most important? Do you think it's king and country? Patriotism, desire to beat the Germans? What do you think keeps them going, Gary?
It's going to be comradeship. It's going to be your mates. So you'll make your own entertainment. You'll get very close to certain people, and you'll look for ways to fill the day with your mates, and that's what it's going to be about.
And that's what this podcast is about. Spot on, Gary. One thing I like to look at the cooks, because we interviewed Cook Sergeant Ted Hayward, who started as a private and ended up as a brigadier. This is the one that's not like you. He was the brigadier in charge of the Army Service Corps by the time he finished. And he set up his cookhouse with the big petrol burners in a big cave in the escarpment. There's an escarpment at Tobruk. Now, they only fed the headquarters staff and anybody who passed by, if you like, usually about 80, mainly from 425 battery. But guess what the main element in the diet was, Gary?
Whelks.
Well, no, that's you on holiday. When
Bully beef by any chance?
Janet says that after you've been on the beach and your diet, you actually look like a whelk. Bully beef. Yeah, come on, give us a quote from Ted Hayward, Gary.
We were on very simple rations. 6 days a week corned beef and 1 day a week tinned M&V, meat and vegetable ration. Never such a thing as menu planning. You went off the cuff, what was there. If we had curry powder, we used to make a curry stew of bully beef with a bowl of rice, not too hot because most of the chaps wouldn't like it. Then you would mix some of your M&V rations with your bully beef to get a certain amount of vegetables inside a stew. We did meat pies on tin plates. You put your bully beef and vegetables on the plate, put a bit of pastry on the top and pushed it in the oven. We were able to make bully beef fritters, which were very popular. Make a flour and water batter, cut a slice of bully beef, drop it in the batter, fry it in a pan for 2 or 3 minutes.
Unbelievable. And you know, it's bully beef, bully beef, bully beef. However you disguise it, it's still bully beef. And a lot of the men, I mean, they would say in the interviews, and I never, once I got home, I never ate bully beef again. And bully beef has sort of disappeared from our lives now, hasn't it? It's funny. Now, they also had tinned provisions and what are the army always called dog biscuits, which are highly nutritious, lovely biscuits, about 3 inches by 2.5 inches. Guess what they tasted of, Gary?
Dog biscuit, and they're very good for your teeth.
Now, the gun positions... other gun positions are dotted around in the centre of Tobruk. The men had to do their own cooking, and this is Captain Bob Hingston. He wanted to organise the men to do their own cooking in their gun pits, partly because it's good for morale, and partly because then they'd be ready for action at any time. He said, that's what Bob Hingston said. I said, look here, I'm going to divide these rations to each gun pit. Each gun will draw your own rations, and you can cook your own food. It worked extremely well. They cooked their own food, and there were no grumbles. What do you think? Do you think that's true, Gary?
Absolutely.
British.
I'm sure that,
I mean,
they loved it.
You personally are known to never complain. I remember several times in life, you just never complain, have you? So, rather a competition developed as to who could make a real sort of cordon bleu dinner for them. But it's the same. It's still bully beef and biscuits.
Bully beef.
Very few fresh vegetables, so they had ascorbic acid tablets. Occasionally they got real limes. This is to prevent scurvy.
Scurvy, yeah.
But the other thing is desert sores. Now, we talked about that in our Mercer Matru, the defence of Egypt with the South Notts Hussars. And desert sores are horrible, great carbuncles that they got. And they still had a lot of them. Awful. They did have plenty of food. It just was dull. But they were short of something. Again, let's brainstorm. What could they have been short of in the desert?
Women.
I somehow knew you could say that. Spot on, Gary. You picked that, and that is true. They were short of women. Anything else you could imagine in the desert?
Radios.
They had plenty of radios, you bastard.
Water, Peter.
Hey! And I've got a quote here from Ted Holmes. Now, Ted Holmes is from Chesterfield, and he was a lovely man. I shall always remember that interview. We were allowed 1/2 gallon of water a day. That sounds a lot, doesn't it? And a good portion of that went to the cookhouse. Oh. We used to have our water bottle, which held about 1.5 pints, filled every other day. The shortage of water was a bigger enemy than the Germans were in a way. The heat was about 110 degrees in the shade. And no shade. Love that. You were really thirsty. Your lips used to be cracked and bleeding all the time. We used to dream about putting your head under the tap at home. I often dream about putting your head under a tap, Gary.
I often dream about putting your head under a pillow.
Oh, dear. Well, how would you be there when I was... Gary. Every man had to husband the water. And how did Fred Langford husband his water? Because I like Fred Langford as well. Tell us how he did it, Gary.
Sergeant Fred Langford. It was a matter of real economy of priorities, really and truly. Drink first of all. Any water that was left over, that would be a matter of washing your shirt in it. Maybe, before it got too thick, you'd have a shave. And when it was really no good at all, that was the time to wash your socks.
Or to offer it to a friend who was really thirsty. Gary, just, you look thirsty, mate. Just have this. And you pass the water, you just washed your socks in. There's something else that might go short in the desert. Can you think what that might be, Gary? Besides women and radios and...
it's going to be smokes, isn't it? People smoke. Even in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, when I was in the army, when you lit a cigarette, the minute you lit a cigarette, somebody would shout, "Two's up," which meant they wanted to share the cigarette with you. So I should imagine that was a real issue for them.
Yeah, because remember, the smokers then smoked 40 to 60 a day. I've never smoked, but in the 70s, I remember people smoking 40. I had a strange girlfriend, we'll call her Frank, who smoked 40 Marlboro, those red boxes, full strength. I mean, that's a lot now. But before that, they smoked a lot more than that. They smoked 60 a day. That they were chain smokers, and they had a cigarette ration, but they're nowhere like 40 a day, did they? And this is good.
And again, in the 70s and 80s when I was in, they almost encouraged smoking. They would give you smoke breaks, smoke for those who have them. There was a culture around smoking, even as late as when I was in the army.
Gunner Frank Knowles, I smoked as many as I could get. I've smoked my rations straight off in a day. Your cigarette rations varied. In theory, you should get 50 cigarettes a week, but you might have to go 3 weeks before you got any. If you smoke 40 a day and then you get 50, that's all you've got for, say, 2 or 3 weeks. They get desperate. What else do men want? Besides women, radios. I'm surprised that your selection of radios is something that men want in the desert, but there you go. What else?
Let me think. Would it be alcohol of some description?
It would be, and there was supposed to be a rum ration. A rum ration did arrive later in the siege. The very first time it arrived, Lance Bombardier Albert Swinton was sent to fetch it for the whole of D Troop. And I love this quote, because can you imagine the lads are back in the gun pits, desperate for this rum ration. And go on, tell us what happens, Albert, or new Albert.
Sergeant Bill Barker said, "Hey, go across to the command post, Bert. There's a rum ration." The battery command post was 200 or 300 yards away. I went up there. They gave me a rum jar, 3 parts full of rum for the troop. I set back across the desert and had got halfway back when old Jerry started shelling us something rotten. I thought to myself, do I be British and walk through this lot, or do I hit the deck and break the bottle of rum? I thought, if I lose this rum, I'll get killed anyway. I was between the devil and the deep blue sea.
I love it. I could just imagine. They would have killed him. Now, they were supposed to drink the rum immediately, but Dennis Middleton... Now, we've had Dennis Middleton before. He's cropped up in quotes. And he was quite a lad, was Dennis Middleton. When I knew him, he was a little old man. But this is what people forget. The little old men that used to be, our uncles and all the rest, that seemed so dull and boring, they were just... Well, and like us, I suppose, that when they were in 1920, they were a handful, This is Lance Sergeant Dennis Middleton. And he says this: Jeff Douglas had the bright idea of saving it up for a week and then having a party. So we formed what we called the Saturday Club. This was half a dozen or so of us at battery headquarters. We did this for 1 or 2 Saturdays, and then the third Saturday, one of us, I can't remember who it was, overdid this and came out from this dugout absolutely tight, where Major Peter Birkin was outside. It was the most appalling row. That was the end of the Saturday Club. And I just love the idea. Whatever you do in the British Army, however you try and organise it, the lads will manage to get drunk if they can. Beer you could get from the canteen truck, which would come round. It's strange to say, but they did have a truck, but very infrequently. They had to get it from the Naffy depot back into Tobruk, and the Naffy depot was empty. And there's a good quote from Gunner Ted Whitaker. He was a cartoonist, a very good cartoonist, and I put some of the cartoons in my book, At Close Range. Bit of a theme developing there. Come on, Ted Whitaker, tell us about the beer ration.
They announced rather rashly that somebody had paid for a whole consignment of beer. There would be 1 bottle of beer per man for the whole garrison. And they said when it was coming. The day the ship arrived, in daylight, the Stookers came over and it got into the harbour. All we ever saw was this big plume of smoke. I drew this cartoon with 2 chaps talking and a big column of smoke in the background just saying, "Oh, I see the beer ship's coming."
Yes, and the cartoon is a cracker. It's a really good one. Now, where do they live? They don't have huts. They just live in gun pits, shallow dugout, very occasionally caves. That's more the headquarters staff near the escarpment edge. A lot of them lived in former Italian concrete emplacements because remember, the Italians had occupied it and defended it. And there's a problem you get in most. It's not the Italians are dirty. It's just where men are, you get fleas. Tell us about that. You're going to be Gunner Bill Hutton.
I just couldn't stand the dugouts. They were so full of fleas. If there was a flea on you and I stood next to you, it would jump off you and onto me. They love me, fleas do. Some people would have fleas crawling over them and it just itched them. But the fleas didn't bite them, or they weren't allergic to them. But if a flea bit me, I used to come up with a great big bump. I used to sleep outside. I was more terrified of fleas than I was of bombs.
And I like that, and I'm allergic to things. As you know, when I got stung by that wasp, my hand swelled up to 3 times the normal size, which was very funny. Now, guess how they dealt with the fleas? And this is unbelievable, but if you're in the army, again, you've got fleas in your dugout, what would you do? You've got no water, but you've got a lot of petrol. This is Gunner Ernie Hurry. We used to put a lot of petrol on the floor, scattered on the floor, to kill these sand fleas. We were playing cards when somebody lit a cigarette and threw the match on the floor. All of a sudden, there was a bang. It didn't set fire. It exploded. I wasn't the first out through the door, but I was second. When Penny, that's a bloke called Pennington, came out, he'd got no eyebrows. He looked ever so funny. He said, "What silly bugger struck a match?" I just love it. And it's just the idea of putting petrol all, to kill the fleas. But they also used them on their clothes. And this is Sgt George Pearson. He's occurred a lot in these recordings, podcasts we've been doing. Tell us what Sgt George Pearson said.
Your clothes do get these lice in them, and we used to get a half a petrol tin, put petrol in it, and soak your overalls or shirt in petrol. You then put that over a low petrol fire, so that the petrol heated up, and that seemed to get rid of these lice. Then you let your shirt dry out and washed it in such water as you could get. It sounds so ridiculous now.
What must have happened on countless occasions?
I can imagine there's quite a lot of people walking around without shirts after that.
Now, what other things could be a problem in the desert? Let's do brainstorming again. We like brainstorming, don't we? What else could be a problem in the desert?
Well, there's quite a lot of sand.
Sandstorms.
Sandstorms, yeah. I mean, you get wind. It would be like being sand blasted, I should imagine.
Yeah, the Camseam, they called it, And this is Bombardier Harold Harper, great bloke. You saw the sandstorm coming along. It just looked like one red mass in the air, blotted out the sun and everything. The sand would hit you so hard that it would even make your skin bleed. We used to dress ourselves up and look like these cowboys with scarves over our faces. All you could see were a little bit of 2 eyes. That's a lovely image of just, And all told, they were often filthy dirty. There's dust everywhere, sandstorms. It's hot. It was just uncomfortable. Can you imagine? You know the old thing when you're on the beach and sand gets everywhere. We can draw a veil over where the sand gets with you, Gary. We don't need to discuss it, but it does get everywhere. You know.
But that's why William Pringle is actually right. You know, so to pursue that, you know, making sure the men kept up the hygiene. It was for morale, yes, but actually, it's for their own well-being as well.
Now. But it's almost to add insult to injury. But whilst it's hot and they've got sandstorms, in the night it's cold. That's one of the things in the desert. It is cold at night. That's a real shock. So they go from wearing next to nothing, and then next minute they're having to wear a greatcoat just to keep warm. Now, this is one of the bits that we always feature at large, mainly because of certain experiences you had at Gallipoli, which I've not mentioned much in these podcasts, but
hardly ever.
When you were stricken with Bain's disease, if you remember, although you call it Hammond's disease, after Bryn Hammond, the famous historian, who's one of the people who never listens to our podcast, so we feel free to mention him. He was my boss at the War Museum for the last 10 years. He was lovely.
He looks 93, even though he's only 24.
That's it.
I think it's something to do with being your boss.
He has led a hard life. So you're going to be Sergeant Ian Sinclair. Now, I'm surprised you're Sergeant Ian Sinclair, because he was so good looking that his troop was called Glamour Troop later in the war. So I'm thinking of you
That's
as
why I chose to do it.
Glamorous Gary.
Glamorous Gary.
Or Sergeant Ian Sinclair. Go on then.
You usually waited until after dark, took a shovel and walked away until you found an empty area. You did whatever you had to do and covered it over again. The men knew that they had to cover their excreta because of the flies. You lived with the flies all around your mouth and up your nose. The very thought that those flies might have been in somebody's excreta made them really keen, so they did cover over.
I think he was on his best behaviour with recording an interview, because I can't imagine any British soldier ever saying anything other than shit.
Yeah, and now we've mentioned this before, haven't we, about, you know, what are flies attracted to? So the flies would go from shit to jam, when we were talking about Gallipoli, to mouth, to dead bodies.
Your bully beef fritter is going to be very attractive to your discerning fly. A cup of tea, a lot of them say with tea, they're wafting their hand over the tea. But here's let's look at Bombardier Harold Harper, and this is what he says. This was something we learned in the early stages. Flies cause dysentery. There's nothing you could do about them. To eat a slice of bread and jam was a nightmare. Jam. Dun, dun, dun. You'd swat the flies off, and in the split second between swatting them off and getting the jam in your mouth, you'd have another couple of flies in your mouth. I had dysentery, but not quite as bad as some poor devils. I recall one very, very strong sergeant major crawling from his dugout on his hands and knees, trying to get to the troop latrine and leaving a trail behind him all the way. He was taken away. He means taken away back to hospital and then evacuated from Tobruk. And that's the thing. No matter how strong and hairy-assed you are as a soldier, you know. And I still remember seeing you. We were on Imbros, which is an island off Gallipoli. And when you were trying to get to that latrine that stood like a sort of place of worship almost to you at that moment in time, and you're sort of crawling, and when you came, and then the screams from inside the latrine, and then when you crawled out, you know, a man wasted. And so I have some small idea, but that's joking aside. That's a horrible story, you know, a trail.
But also, it's exacerbated by a lack of water, because you can't properly wash and keep hygienic. And so
there's no water.
There's no water.
And this is what Gunner Ted Holmes said. You've got no means of cleaning yourself. A lot of us had diarrhoea, what we call jippy tummy. You only got to cough sometimes, and it shot out of your backside like water. Now, that is not something... I just want to make this clear. That's not something you find in letters or diaries. Dear Mum, shat myself 3 times. You know, dear Mum, arse red raw.
It used to feature in my letters home to my mum.
But you wouldn't have a girlfriend most of the time. But writing to your girlfriend, oh dear, had another accident, coughed, surprised. You know, splattered everywhere. It's not. And this is why oral history is important, because oral history, it's remembered. Because, of course, it looms large in your memories of just the discomfort. Now, it's not the only thing. They've got a lot of problem with jaundice as well. And that the poor diet triggers jaundice. Now, let's look. So this is what's going on. Could they ever get away from their gun positions? Well, the answer is yes. They were occasionally allowed a 3-day rest period. And, of course, Tobruk is by the sea, and they found a little bay that wasn't under fire particularly, just west of the port. And this is Lance Sergeant John Walker. You could get and he said this, you could get a pass for a couple of days and lie on the rocks. Dive into the most gorgeous, clear sea water that was possible. It was quite tepid for the top 3 foot, but as you dived further down, it got cooler and cooler until it got quite cold. It was just like eating a lovely ice cream in a way. It was delicious. And, I think a lovely quote, but that's just a brief interlude. British Army, of course, Lieutenant Charles Laborde. People see fish. How would the British Army go fishing, Gary? So tell us what Charles Laborde did.
Lieutenant Charles Laborde. You pulled the pin out and tossed this Mills bomb into the water. There was duly a wham underneath and a great column of water. You waited 2 or 3 minutes and then the dead fish started to come up to the surface. We then all popped into the water and picked out the best of the fish so that we got a change of diet from the bully beef. You can imagine that, can't you?
It's a standard. They used to do it at Gallipoli as well. It's just the British, fishing.
Shall we make a rod? No, let's just throw a Mills bomb in there.
But the beach is an exception. Let's go. So what did the men do? They basically just sat in their gun pits or dugouts. They're going to make their own amusement. And conversation's incredibly important. Now, you sat around with the army. What sort of things would you chat about?
Well, you talk about where you come from, you talk about your girlfriends, you might exaggerate that a little bit. You talk about your background, what you like, what you don't like. You play games, you make things up. Cards become incredibly important. Gambling schools usually start, and I usually lost. And it's all a bit manly. I know that's probably not a word that describes it well, but it is. It's a bit manly. You're talking about football and girls and beer and going down a pub and that sort of stuff.
And that's exactly what the men told us they talked about then. Here's Captain William Pringle. Women, usually the number one subject with a soldier. What was happening in the war in the rest of the world? Now, that's something obviously you and your mates didn't discuss because that's not happening. They were always wanting to know what would happen if Hitler won. I can just imagine, sir, what are we going to do if Hitler wins? You always answered that by saying, he won't. I love that. Letters from home are incredibly important. I'm not sure they were important in your time, but the British Army's always made an effort to get letters out.
It was important. I mean, you've got the BFPO system. So they had their own Royal Mail, if you like, system, British Forces Post Offices around the world. And it is very important. Getting a letter maintains that contact. You're in touch with your relatives.
Now, you're going to be Gunner Ted Whittaker now, aren't you?
I am. And Gunner Ted Whittaker says, Mother and Father would write that they were all right, that everybody was happy, which of course they weren't, expressing concern and hinting that they knew where I was. I wrote to let them know that I was all right, because I'd begun to realise that to all the folks at home, it was all more desperate than it was for us. In Tobruk, we never felt in any desperate situation. There was always a tremendous spirit that we were there. We were going to stay there, and nothing would shift us.
So that's a sign of good morale. As ever with oral history, that's him. Other people felt much more scared about the future. I want to make that clear. But, you've got to respect. That's what he thought. Now, they could also get parcels from home. You're going to be Lance Bombardier Albert Swinton, one of my favourites.
I was 21 and I got a parcel that my stepfather had done up. He'd really gone to town on it, putting it in sacking and sewn it up. When I got it, the cake was missing. Somebody had swiped my birthday cake. Other bits and bobs were in there, but somebody down at the base had pinched me cake. There was me, sticking me neck out, up in the desert, and there's people down in Cairo pinching all our stuff.
And you read that beautifully. You could get that's just what happened. It's like he was in the room. Now, the men also craved news from outside, and one source of this is, Gary, wirelesses. Radios.
Or radios.
As they are now known. And the signals would be on the regimental net, but a lot of them managed to get a spare wireless, and they listened to. There were music broadcasts they could pick up from Cairo, but guess who else they listened to? British Army. Who should we listen to? Should we listen to British Home Service, the BBC, or should we listen to something else? What else should we listen to?
Lord Hawha. On Germany Calling. It was a German, German propaganda programme, wasn't it? Lord Hawha, I think, was an Irish citizen.
William Joyce. And
I think he used to name individual units and things, didn't he, in his broadcasts?
He did, and it's strange, the British attitude to him. Well, in the end, they kill him. They hang him.
Yeah.
Which, as he was an Irish American, is quite strict, but he was probably a complete bastard.
Well, it's questionable. He's not a British. He was hung for treason, and he wasn't a British subject. So how can he be treasonable?
Now tell us, you're going to be gunner Ted Whittaker again. Tell us about that.
We'd listen to the wireless at night and pass the news round to the troops. For instance, the BBC announced one night, a Midlands town has been heavily bombed, some casualties. We switched to Lord Hawha, and he said, "Good evening, South Notts Hussars. As you've heard, Nottingham has been obliterated tonight." Often, he was more informative than the BBC. Once he said, "Good evening, South Notts Hussars. Have you said good morning to the Luftwaffe?"
It's amazing, isn't it? Oh, dear. Now, these are propaganda channels, and here's Bombardier Harold Harper, and he was affected by one thing. He says this: "The only effect I could ever remember of German propaganda getting through to certain memories of the battery was the lady who originally sang Lily Marlene. She used to call us the self-contained prisoners of Tobruk. And this seductive voice would say, 'Of course, while you're here and slaving away, your girlfriends and your wives are enjoying life back in England.'" Was that seductive, Gary?
That was very seductive.
Occasionally you'd get a bloke who would say, "I haven't heard from my wife for 6 months." And it would get through to him that way. And, that's human nature, isn't it? For a few, as ever, religion offers some kind of solace. And the Padre Parry, was quite a character. He was a short, fat little bloke. I wonder if he had duck's legs like you, Gary. He looked like a country parson. He was and he'd go round, visit everybody, visit the lads. He made sure everyone was properly buried. He never flinched, from what was going on. And it's
funny, isn't it, that Padres often are characters. If you take the Great War, First World War, got Tubby Clayton, who set up Talbot House, for example, short, rather overweight. They're always somebody that you can describe, Peter. I think that's quite odd. There's always something distinctive about
They are, and whatever your opinion on religion, it does help men who are faced with the end. This is the end, beautiful friend. Yes. Now, let's look at some of the other ways that men kept themselves in use. Well, esoteric pastimes, I think you describe these as. Let's hear from Lance Bombardier Albert Swinton. Come on, Gary.
Bill Barker, he organised himself a garden. Sounds a bit stupid, I know. Well, especially as water was short supply. He was a very keen gardener in civvy life. He'd go round the desert, got little bits of scrub, and planted them into this little patch. Any spare water with leaves, he'd go and water his garden.
So with tea leaves and stuff, yeah.
Yeah. He was a great fisherman too, and he'd sit there for hours with a bit of stick casting, as though he was fishing. Everybody said he was puddled. He wasn't, but it makes you think.
I just love the idea of him sat at the dug pit with a stick pretending to fish.
I should think they were relieved he didn't do it in the same way that the others did and just throw Mills bombs around him.
Round the gun pits. Yeah. Now, that would be worrying. Now, the next quote, we're going into a sort of surrealistic bit. This features Bombardier Ray Ellis. Ray Ellis is a headmaster in later life. He was about 19, 20 at this time. And I know when you first saw this quote, Gary, you wondered about his age. Yeah, he was young. Tell us this story.
Bombardier Ray Ellis. We sometimes played cowboys and Indians from the films we'd grown up with. Schoolboy games around the gun pits. Once we were doing this, and I was an Indian with a stick, which was supposed to be a tomahawk. This is ridiculous. This is men in action. Jim Hardy, the Sergeant Major, was a cowboy. He came charging up, and in the excitement of the thing, he forgot, drew his revolver, and fired, and nearly put a bullet through me. That sobered us down a bit.
And they formed a group which they called the Noble Antediluvian and Most Noble Order of Jerboas.
That's easy for you to say.
It was. I thought I did quite well there, Gary, given my normal spoonerisms. The Jerboas are desert rat. There were a lot of them about. Now, like real Dame Masons, their actions, their activities are they range from, well, eccentric to strange. This is when they're not killing prostitutes, of course. That's the other main thing that Masons get up to, as I understand from my studies of the past.
I got confused there for a moment. I thought you were suggesting that was what the South Notts Hussars were getting up to.
No, Masons. I remember that. It was, by the way, it's a fairly ludicrous theory that it was all down to Masons. That Jack the Ripper was I shouldn't have mentioned that. Because Masons are very good people. Very good, except for Gary. Right, come on, Gary. You're going to be Ray Ellis again.
We would all sit round, and the lodge is now in session. When in session, we were not allowed to laugh. You had to keep your face straight. You had to sing the lodge anthem. It was a song from the Boer War, and the words went like this. The Boers have got my dad, they have, my soldier daddy. We changed it to, the whores have got my dad, they have, my soldier daddy. I don't like to see my mummy sigh. I don't like to see my mummy cry. I'm going across the ocean on a big ship. I'm going to fight the whores, I am, and bring my daddy safely home. Now, you had to sing this without laughing. It was so bloody ridiculous. A lot of hairy-arse gunners sitting around in a circle singing these stupid little childish songs. If you laughed, you had to pay a forfeit, and these were pretty terrible. You might have to piss in your boot or take your penis and allow one member of the team to lash it 3 times with a bootlace. Horrific things. While this was taking place, everybody could laugh. But when the punishment had taken place, Jim Hardy, who was usually in charge, would say, calling the lodge to order. And you'd have to somehow take any smile off your face. Of course you couldn't.
Can you imagine being sat opposite when he talks about that, especially the bit about the penis? I mean, that sounds just like your own lodge. Well, you're laughing, so clearly it is. Yeah. I don't want you to give any secrets away, or they'll come and kill you, won't they? So, we'll draw a veil over the rest of your lodge act. But these are. I mean, it's just. People might think that's gross and disgusting. The point is, this is soldiers, this is men, this is very young men, just passing time. Now,
it's also the humour that develops. You're a great fan of the Goon Show, I know, and they, were in the forces at this time. Harry Seacombe was in the desert, I believe. So, it's that warped humour, but it's necessary to keep going.
And it is warped and it is strange, and people say it's almost perverse. But, if you listen to the Good Show, you hear people talking about green stream. Their thing was to get it past the censor. So they've called something a green streamer. And they have all these phrases that are actually very rude or very horrible. They get through. Now, this is another quote from Albert Swinton. And this is a great quote, Gary. Go on. For me, I want you to picture this. Albert Swinton was about 6'2". He was a boxer. He's built like a brick shithouse. Gary, you were a very small boxer. This is a big, heavyweight boxer. So read this quote, and if you don't laugh at or smile at this, then there's something wrong with you.
In front of the gun position, there was a knocked-out Italian tank. One day, we went forward to it, and we levered off the turret. And there was 200 or 300-inch ball bearings. We confiscated these and set up a marbles league. In the charge cases, there was a cardboard cup about 2 inches in diameter and about 1.5 inches deep. We used to set these out into the desert and scrape a board along so that all the sand was level like a miniature golf course. We flicked these ball bearings into these various cups. One day the colonel came along and there was all his troop on their hands and knees flicking these ball bearings about. He said, "Most intriguing, what's happening?" We told him and he said, "Oh, can I have a go?" And there was the colonel on his hands and knees playing marbles with us.
I just love that quote. It was so you can hear all these on the if they've put them up now, they will be putting them up soon because all these people are sadly dead on the Imperial War Museum site, because these are from Imperial War Museum interviews, which is how I got them. Now that's all happy, but what else would happen in the desert, do you think? What would happen if me and you were locked in the desert in a small dugout for best part of 6 months?
I'd probably kill you.
Yeah. A combination
You'd get on each other's nerves.
You'd get on each other's nerves. I mean, even the best of chums. And they get tetchy, it might be. You know, things that you'd put up with normally become important. And, you know, and this is Gunner George Loyally. And you're going to read this one, Gary. And I can picture you. Your sunny disposition is never marred by even a frown. But I can imagine, after being locked up in a dugout with me for 6 months, you'd be a bit like this.
Gunner George Loyally. We were getting bloody fed up of standing around doing nothing. Taffy Stanway and I were arguing about gun laying or something like that. He turned round and said, "Right, I'll knock your bloody block off." I said, "All right, you just try it. The best thing to do is get the gloves and we'll have a box." We did. No refereeing. I gave him a good hiding. You see, with me being small and him being a bit taller than me, he thought he could take the rattle out of us. But I showed him that a little man can beat a big man and fetch him down. I knocked him out.
I feel vaguely threatened by your attitude during that quote.
The word vaguely isn't necessary in that sentence.
The men gradually, you know, Operation Battle Axe had failed in June. You know, they sort of recover. But then, it's July becomes, it's a bit like in lockdown now, except 10 times, 20 times, 100 times worse. You know, months pass and then morale begins to fade again. And this is Battery Quartermaster Sgt Charles Ward. By the time it got to October, there were no signs at all of another attempt to relieve us. Gradually, the cumulative effect of all the bombing and shelling tended to get you down. Although I can't remember anyone becoming what we call bomb-happy, but there were signs of a certain amount of tenseness. I felt twitchy, my nerves a bit on edge. The tendency was to run for a slit trench rather than walk there. I think there were certain people who worked their ticket to get back. One or two of them simulated certain illnesses that were difficult to detect and got evacuated. Stomach disorders, bowel complaints, fever, that sort of thing. It was never proved, so we were never bothered about it. It didn't affect us. And you've got to remember, people are still dying. It's not mass casualties, but there were a lot of people who died in the early days of the siege, and there was still a drip of people being killed or badly wounded. And this is Ray Ellis again, and what a thoughtful man he was. But also, he always just seems to sum up how the ordinary man feels, and that's what we're interested in. What ordinary people react to extraordinary circumstances, and in a way that makes them to us amazing and extraordinary. Go on, Ray, tell us.
Lance Sergeant Ray Ellis. You looked for all sorts of omens. I can remember looking for omens in the sky, shapes of clouds which would suggest good things. Your mind was involved in this sort of thing, but I never thought of being killed. It was always the other man who was going to die. You had this feeling that, yes, you would survive. Really, at the back of your mind, you realised you were kidding yourself.
And I think that's a great quote. It just explains how people are, how one reason people can keep going. Ellis always believed that, and we're not naming names, and I've not looked it up in the book either, that one NCO and his troop had given way and earned his ticket by pretending to go mad. And troops reacted in a strange way to what they could perceived as cowardice, because they all felt fear. They knew they'd feel fear again, but what they had contempt for was men who gave way to their fears. It was, and this is Realist again.
We all lost our nerve sometimes. Even if he didn't run, he wished he could. We understood. There was a lot of bravado, but we all knew that we were pretending. We all knew that each other was frightened. If a man broke for a few moments, you sort of forgot it. You didn't notice it because you knew he'd been all right till then. And he'd be all right again. Anyone who was really cowardly, he was out. We had no pity for people who couldn't sustain their courage.
Again, I think he summed it up there, don't you? Don't you feel that's how it would be? I mean, you were never in action. Of course you weren't, and I'm a bloody civilian. But I think it sums it up. Do you?
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that they find very difficult to deal with, any soldier, is the randomness of it all. It's the person standing next to you, it's the person in front of you. It's never you, of course. So it's the effect on the nerves. And all he's saying in that quote is, you can have a wobble, you can have a moment, but you've got to stand. With your mates, you are staying.
So comradeship, underline everything still.
Yeah, yeah.
And the other thing to remember is if you get ill, Gary, it's very difficult to be brave if you're, if half the world seems to be passing through your backside, on a, and you're losing strength, you feel dreadful, you've got blinding headache. It must be very difficult to be brave in an air raid if you feel like that. And do you think boredom undermines courage? Or?
Yeah, well, it eats away at it, doesn't it? The longer that siege goes on, the more difficult it becomes to maintain that morale and the sense that, there was the quote earlier about never being shifted. It becomes more difficult. And then you've got, all the time, you've got the bleeding Germans just outside, It must have been terrible, terrible.
They must have had this feeling. It's people if you think back, it's probably after lockdown. If you think back to how in lockdown, people are thinking, oh, if only it was all over, the world will be perfect. We'll be able to go out to the pub. Everything will be great. And the men at Tobruk must have had a feeling like that, but times 10. When the siege is over, we'll be rescued and life's going to be great. That must be how they felt. Do you not think, Gary?
Yeah, and equally, as with the pandemic, that's not necessarily true, is it?
And we'll be following that story. I mean, just the breakout operations killed a lot of people. The siege drags on for 7 months. 7 months. And then next episode, we'll be dealing with the breakout operations. I've loved doing it today. I love dealing with the men at war. It's something, in a sense, foreign to me, but because I was lucky working for the War Museum to talk to so many veterans, it's been fantastic. I hope you've enjoyed doing this, Gary. It is men at war. It's how people react to something that is outside our experience.
Yes, and I feel lucky to talk to you, Pete.
You undermine everything I do. That was such a lovely emotional finish, and now you've just brought it down to nothing. Sigh.
My work is done.
My work is not done. Cheers, everybody. Thanks a lot.
See you, Pete.